It's the world this week, 7 days, 4 Paris-based correspondents, or should we say 3.5. The world this week in partnership with the Daily Beast. Foreign editor Christopher Dickey happens to be on the other side of the Atlantic this week in New York. Thanks for joining us.
Well, the half of me that's here is very happy.
Okay. Well, we'll be tapping into both halves of you. With us as well, France 24 senior producer Sarah Bertelsen.
Hello.
Thanks for coming downstairs to the studio.
You're welcome.
All right. Pierre Aski, President Reporters Without Borders.
Hello.
You now can hear Monday to Friday on the French public radio station France Inter.
That's right. In the morning, international comments.
All right. Cracking the whip over at Eurosport, Andreas Evagora, the head of news content there. Thank you for being with us.
Good to be here.
The World This Week on Facebook and Twitter. Hashtag World This Week. Exactly 1 month from today, Brazil goes to the polls, and in a nation mired in corruption scandals where the favorite is in jail, the incumbent party on the ropes, now comes an assassination attempt. Former military officer Jair Bolsonaro in stable condition after being stabbed repeatedly in the midsection at a rally by a far-left supporter. It happened in the southeastern city of Juiz de Fora. Authorities investigating the suspect's mental health. Bolsonaro, a controversial candidate for his hardline security tactics, as well as his statements about blacks, gays, and women. Second in the polls, his support seemed to have plateaued. But what about now?
I have a message for the criminals who tried to take the life of a family man, a man that we expect to be the father of millions of Brazilians. You just elected the president. He's going to win in the first round.
You just elected the president, Pierre Aski.
Well, it's a strange election campaign because we first had Lula, the former president, who is in jail, who was prevented from registering his candidacy, was rejected by a court. Now we have this candidate that was stabbed, and as your correspondent said earlier, it's going to be a boost for him because apparently he's very bad in interviews and he will be prevented from giving interviews. So it's a strange campaign, and I must say, Brazil was a few years ago the beacon of Latin America with the a bright upcoming economy and leaders that were shining all over the world. And today, the political spectrum is pretty gloomy, I must say.
Just a few days ago, Christopher Dickey, in this very studio, we had guests from Brazil saying, look, Bolsonaro's gotten about as much support as he's going to get. He can't be president. What about now?
Well, I think it's hard to predict, but I think this will certainly work to his benefit. I think the report from on the ground in Brazil was probably very accurate. This is going to get him a sympathy vote. It's going to mean that he doesn't give horrible interviews that will actually damage his candidacy. And in this chaotic environment, I think the voters really don't trust anybody. There is a tendency, certainly we've seen it in Europe, we're about to see it in Sweden, for far-right politicians to gain ground. So whether he will win in the first round, I'm not sure, but it does look like he will have a good shot at getting into a second round.
And there's the military background and the political incorrectness of Bolsonaro.
Yes. I'm starting to think that, once we talked about politics being boring, and that was maybe a good time, because now over the last years, we've seen election campaigns all over the world being soap operas, and but now with very real victims. So it's sad, and we see the politics is getting more and more polarized, and this time in Brazil we're seeing the same thing as we've seen elsewhere.
You talk about nostalgia, Sarah Bertelsen, for some kind of golden age. Sources tell the Reuters news agency that after Thursday's rejection of Lula by the Supreme Court, he's going to be next Monday handing over the baton to his running mate, former Sao Paulo mayor Fernando Haddad. Haddad, who's trying to emerge from all the chaos.
The people are asking for that time back, when people had confidence in the economy, had confidence in the country, had confidence in its institutions when Brazil was heard on the international scene.
How do you rebound from the chaos that Brazil is mired in right now?
It's going to be fascinating to see the impact of political violence because, well, we condemn, obviously, the act yesterday. This is not someone who's looking to dampen sentiment and bring about a lot of peaceful sentiment in Brazil.
Yeah, our correspondent was saying his running mate saying the professionals of violence are us.
Well, he said a policeman isn't a policeman unless he kills people. So, you know, that's pretty violent. But relating it to my home country, the last political assassination in Britain, Joe Cox, in 2016, a lot of people thought, well, it would bring her some sympathy after what happened. She was murdered by...
she was for Remain. It was in the build-up to that Brexit vote.
She was assassinated by someone from the extreme right. But it was kind of used quite cleverly by the extreme right to undermine her family, to undermine what the kind of society she was talking about. So it's not necessarily going to work in a favour that we might expect. For instance, in Brazil, will some people fear going back to the bad old days of violence? Will they think, is this the kind of society we want to go back to? Will it work against this candidate? Or will they say, as some of your correspondents have said already, that it will give them a big sympathy vote? We'll see that once the election comes.
It could play both ways, Christopher Dickey.
Yeah, it probably could play both ways, but I feel that the omens are not good on this one. And I think the real problem in Brazil is that you had a country that was rich, that was, as Pierre said, a sort of a beacon for all of Latin America. And for the last couple of years, it's been totally mired in corruption scandals, where everybody, from former President Lula, who's now in jail, to the parliament that basically threw him out, has been accused of very, very serious crimes of corruption. So at the end of the day, I think that the faith of the electorate in these politicians is very low, and that's when the electorate starts to reach for the extremes. I think that's always a danger.
Which brings us to the political climate where you are right now. The book is called A Fear, the latest tome by longtime Washington Post investigative reporter Bob Woodward. It chronicles chaos inside the Trump White House. Hits the bookstores next week, citing numerous sources. Excerpts by the journalist who helped break the Watergate scandal wide open include plenty of the same backstabbing anecdotes as in Michael Wolff's Fire and Fury. This time, added to it, are tales of senior staff members effectively trying to save Trump from himself. According to Woodward, his former economic advisor, Gary Cohn, stole a letter off of Trump's desk that the president was intending to sign to formally withdraw the U.S. from a trade agreement with South Korea. Cohn later told an associate that he removed the letter to protect national security and that Trump did not notice that it was missing. Pierre Aski, your reaction to all of this?
It's, you know, on one side, it's completely mad. I mean, we have a madhouse in the White House, and it's unreal to watch this from afar. On the other side, I wonder if Trump is not winning out of it, because the amount of attacks that he's going under, whether it's from this anonymous letter from one supposedly high responsible in the administration, or from Woodward, the Washington Post, and the mainstream media, play into the victim of the system, play into the plot mentality that he's been working on for months. And I'm wondering whether all this is not backfiring into making the ground voters of Trump holding. I was watching, there's a news website in the US, 538, which collects all the opinion polls. And you look at it, and it still has 40% support among American voters after everything that has been said about him. And that's about the same as Ronald Reagan or Bill Clinton at the same time. And I don't think those 40% voters will be very much affected by what is being published by the Washington Post journalist or in the columns of the New York Times.
Christopher Dickey, the difference this time is that the book is by Bob Woodward. And we had one panelist earlier this week say He's one author whose books are bought by those who vote Republican and Democrat alike.
Well, I think that's true. I mean, he goes way back. His first book was with Carl Bernstein, was All the President's Men, looking deep inside the Nixon administration and leading up to Watergate, and then the final days, and then the Supreme Court, and then book after book after book in which he conducts hundreds of interviews. I have to say, usually there are 2 or 3 key sources who really lay things out for him, and then he confirms those pictures with other interviews. But his stuff has been very reliable, and people always complain, oh, well, I didn't say that, and then later on they often admit that, yeah, they did say that once they're out of power. So I think it's a pretty accurate picture of what's going on inside the administration, and as somebody summed it up, it's a superpower run by a simpleton who is also a man given to huge fits of anger, and is very difficult for his staff to deal with, but who also doesn't know much about the rest of the world and has a few simple ideas that he pursues relentlessly and probably to the detriment of the United States. But for the moment, Trump is still able to coast on the economic prosperity that was built up under President Obama, who, by the way, has a 66% approval rating.
Yeah, and has been saying this Friday that Donald Trump's presidency is a symptom, not a cause, Andreas.
Yeah, I was reading this new word that's trending, lodestar, because that was apparently gives us a clue about who wrote this article. Now, if it was Mike Pence, apparently he's the only man in America who uses this word. Christopher maybe can confirm that. But if that's the case, he'd be a bit naive to put it in the op-ed, which suggests that Mike Pence has plenty of enemies as well. So either way you look at it, it's kind of confusing. But I've got to say it's a bit rich for Trump to criticize anonymous sources, because you remember the New York Post, page 6, you're a New Yorker, you read that page. And he used to call in himself, pretending to be other people. He'd get his aides to call in, put on funny voices, give them anonymous tips and bits of gossip. So he can't really be complaining too much about the use of anonymous sources.
Yeah, I must admit, I too was going to my dictionary the other day, confession here, to look up what lodestar meant. And yes, it is true that the vice president does use the word quite a bit.
That's going to continue to be a lodestar.
Jack's lodestar as our lodestar.
Lodestar. It really was the lodestar.
Lodestar, which means a shining light, a person who leads or...
Yes, and it's a Swedish word, I think, from the beginning. Ledstjärna. It's the same word in Swedish.
There you go.
He was a Swede writing this. No, but I saw an interesting article as well that the BBC run this article through some kind of software that analyzes and compared it to other statements that have been put out by the administration. And, well, they came up with the same conclusion, that it looks very much like Mike Pence, but at the same time, I don't think they're that stupid to make it too obvious.
So do you buy Andreas's theory that it's somebody trying to trip up Mike Pence and therefore putting the word in?
Anyone who has watched House of Cards can believe anything about American politics.
Christopher Dickey.
Well, I think probably it's not Mike Pence, and it's likely that I don't think it was necessarily a conspiracy either. It may be somebody who was listening to Mike Pence a lot, maybe somebody on Mike Pence's staff. As we point out in the Daily Beast today, senior administration official, that covers a lot of ground in Washington. Everybody is a senior administration official. So the idea that this is a cabinet member or the vice president of the United States is probably misguided. My favorite denial, by the way, you saw the dozens and dozens of denials, I didn't say it, it wasn't me, was actually from Melania Trump, that she felt constrained to say, no, she wasn't jerking papers off of the desk of her husband, and she wasn't trying to protect the United States that way, and of course calling the person who did write that column in the New York Times cowardly.
Christopher, I want your reaction to another denial, and this one coming from the U.S. Secretary of State. Let's listen.
I come from a place where if you're not in a position to execute the commander's intent, you have a singular option. It is to leave. And this person instead, according to the New York Times, chose not only to stay, but to undermine what President Trump and this administration are trying to do.
Do you agree with Mike Pompeo, Christopher?
Well, up to a point. I mean, I think when I read it, I was struck by the idea that this was a really cowardly position to take. If you really feel this way, resign. Don't try and tell me you're an anonymous hero protecting the United States from the President of the United States, who you serve, while he also is serving the Republican agenda. This is clearly a Republican position being taken by this anonymous columnist, because he's saying, you know, we're getting our Supreme Court justices, we're getting our tax cut. Those are all good things. It just so happens the president is insane. You know, I think there's a point at which Republicans ought to stand up and say, yes, the president has gone nuts, he's out of his mind, and we need to do something about it, like take him out of office. But that's not what this guy is saying. This guy is saying, keep him in office, but we, the resistance, will keep him on a steady course.
Do you agree with Christopher Sauer?
I don't know. When I read this, yes, it was both. I felt both. You know, it's we go through strange times after all everything we've gone through with Donald Trump. At the
House
same
of
time,
Cards moment.
Yes, but at the same time, it's a bit reassuring to hear that there is an adult in the room. I must say, after everything we've seen. So. I think that the thing is that Donald Trump, as you pointed out, he still has a good support in the public. So I mean, he will be there for still some time to come.
The problem is that I think there was there've been lots of attempts to get him out. You know, talk about impeachment, now talking about this 25th Amendment that I must say I didn't know about, and now everybody's an expert in the 25th Amendment. And it's true that if this man or woman, because we don't know, had come out with all, in the open with all the elements about the unfit nature of Donald Trump to lead this country, maybe it could have started a process. But the anonymous and this idea that we're going to resist from inside by protecting American interests against the president weakens that argument that institutional guarantees are going to save America.
The weakening of U.S. authority. We're going to pick up on that point when we come back. Stay with us. You're watching The World This Week. Welcome back, or welcome if you're just joining us. It's The World This Week. The World This Week in partnership with the Daily Beast. Christopher Dickey at HQ this Friday in New York City. Welcome back. Welcome back as well to Pierre Aski, president of Reporters Without Borders, Andreas Evagora, in charge of news content at Eurosport, and Sarah Bertelsen, senior producer here, France 24. Just before the break, we were talking about the undermining of U.S. authority on the world stage, a point that Pierre Aski made. Donald Trump, who's asked for an investigation by the Justice Department into who wrote that anonymous piece. Christopher Dickey, in the Daily Beast this Friday, there's reporting that officials at the Justice Department were fist-bumping each other after the article was published?
Well, apparently so. I mean, they feel that they are also holding the line, holding the fort against the insanity of the President of the United States, which is a pretty scary proposition. You know, I think these are really perilous and frightening times here in the United States, at least here on the eastern seaboard. Maybe out in the middle of America, people feel content to have Donald Trump ruling the country, and they think everything's going fine. His supporters in the South might think that too. But I ran into General Michael Hayden the other day, who was the director of the CIA and director of the NSA at various stages under the Bush administration, the George W. Bush administration. And I asked him, how does America get out of this? And he said he thinks it'll be a disaster if Trump is removed from office between now and 2020. He thinks 2020 is the only way to do it because, as he put it, this former spy chief, if he is removed, then about 30 or 40% of Americans are going to believe that there was a coup d'etat by people like him, by the so-called deep state. And Trump is laying the groundwork for that every day. This thing, like the letter in the New York Times, the op-ed in the New York Times, and the Woodward book, only confirm that argument in the minds of his supporters.
Yeah, you talk about his supporters in Billings, Montana, Thursday evening. Donald Trump addressing a crowd of 10,000 of them. and seeming, at least during his speech, to take it all in stride.
So I beat all these senators, all these governors, all these brilliant political minds. Then I beat the other side. And then I listen. Is he competent? I think I'm pretty competent, right? Don't you think so? Is he competent?
And that, Pierre Aski, that was your initial point.
Yes. Yes, and I think, you know, what we are witnessing in the US is actually a world phenomenon, is the polarization, extreme polarization of the spectrum. And we have someone like Donald Trump who's probably playing on that so much better than anybody else. And, you know, I was struck by the fact that on 2 days ago, he appeared in front of the cameras after the New York Times piece was published, and he said, "No one can beat me in 2020." And I was wondering, what if he's right? What if all this is playing into his game, into his hands, by showing that the establishment doesn't want somebody like him, and that is sweet to the ears of a good 40% of Americans. And that's a very important thing that I think we are witnessing in a milder way in Europe, although it's getting tougher here too.
And we'll be talking about it in the case of Sweden in a moment. That's not all, by the way, that Donald Trump's been talking and tweeting about this week. On Thursday, he put out this missive, "What was Nike thinking?" His response to the ad that the popular shoe and sportswear brand unveiled for the start of the NFL season, an ad that features Colin Kaepernick, the former San Francisco 49ers quarterback, who's been out of a job since taking a knee during the national anthem as part of Black Lives Matter protests against police brutality.
Believe in something, even if it means sacrificing everything. If you have only one hand, don't just watch football, play it. And if you're a girl from Compton, become the greatest athlete ever. Yeah, that's more like it. So don't ask if your dreams are crazy. Ask if they're crazy enough.
Andreas Evagora, how much of a risk is Nike taking here?
Oh, I think it's a big risk. I mean, let's be honest. Of course, it's a publicity stunt. Of course, it's done to sell more shoes and sell more equipment. But they're taking a big risk because they can't really control the backlash from this. Obviously, people have been burning their shoes online and so on. But I would applaud them despite that, because they're taking this risk. And I think people forget, you know, why is this guy in the news? He made a statement against anti-racism. He's not a criminal. He's not a killer. He's not a dope cheat. He simply said that he's against racism and expressed it in his own way. Now, that should be one of the least controversial things possible for a professional sportsman to do. As you're alluding to, he was in the middle of a $100 million 7-year contract, and he's out of a job. He's not a poor man, but nevertheless, he can't practice his profession anymore. So in that way, I would applaud Nike. They are taking a risk. I think they're perhaps thinking from the political side, is this the tipping point where Donald Trump's popularity might be on the wane? It's a big risk, and let's see if it works out.
All right, among those featured in the ad, tennis great Serena Williams.
Well, I mean, he's done a lot for, you know, the African American community, and it's cost him a lot. And you know, it's sad, but he continues to do the best that he can to support. And having a huge company back him, you know, through, you know, it could be a controversial reason for this company, but they're not afraid. And I feel like that was a really powerful statement to a lot of other companies.
What are you thinking when you listen to Serena Williams, Sarah?
But I would like to think that this is a strong statement, and that, as you said, that this is taking a big risk. But I'm a bit more cynical about this. I think this is excellent promotion. This is excellent PR work, well executed, beautiful. The clip is really, you know, it's really well done. But I think they're in for selling stuff. Nike sells equipment and shoes and clothes, and I think it's well calculated and not so much about convictions as about money.
Not so much about convictions, but about money, Christopher Dickey?
Oh, I think where Nike is concerned, it is about money for sure. It's a business, and this is an advertisement. Let's not forget that. But I think where Kaepernick is concerned, it was about conviction and is about conviction. And I think he showed a hell of a lot more courage than the anonymous op-ed writer in the New York Times. He did what he did in public, and he took the consequences. If he gets a paycheck now, well, God bless.
Pieraski?
Well, I agree that this is marketing, but it's smart and meaningful marketing, and I'd rather see that than those companies pretending to be moral, you know, the do no evil type of slogans.
Yeah, that was Google, right?
That was Google, and doing exactly the opposite. At least they're taking a stand in a very hot and controversial issue.
So here's a philosophical question for you. Can a corporation have a soul?
When it fits with its balance sheet, yes. And that's where the marketing department comes in. I'm sure that if the marketing department had said, it's going to cost us so much, they wouldn't have done it.
I agree that it's completely about the bottom line. It's completely about selling equipment. I wouldn't doubt that at all. But nevertheless, they're the first company who's done it. All the NFL have dropped him. No one wants to go anywhere near this guy. And I think when history is looked back on, Kaepernick will be seen as being on the right side. You know, he's not the first black athlete to be rejected by corporate America, by large parts of America. So let's see how it plays out. But again, of course, it's about Nike selling equipment. But nevertheless, they've made a decision which I think we can applaud.
Nike's made a decision. One final question on this, Christopher Dickey. It's the start of the NFL season. What impact is all this having on American football?
Well, I think the initial coverage of a lot of the games is, will people stand during the national anthem, or will they take a knee? How's that going to work out? The players are being interviewed if before they took a knee and now they don't, or if they sit down. All of that is beginning to, as some of them said, is beginning to feel like a little bit of a distraction. The message is not getting through anymore quite the way it was when Kaepernick was taking a knee alone during the national anthem. But I think, you know, the big question is, where are race relations going in the United States? And they're not going anyplace good. And that's because the President of the United States repeatedly endorses the position of not only far-right people, but of people who are essentially Nazis. Obama in his speech today was very clear. You know, it ought to be simple to reject Nazis, to say you don't support Nazis, that Nazis have no place in our society. And yet, this president fails to do that. He chooses to focus attention on Colin Kaepernick.
We're going to talk now about a political party which has neo-Nazi roots. It's all of Europe on edge ahead of a general election that could see the far right upset the apple cart in Sweden. The Sweden Democrats polling as high as second, even within the margin of error, to dream of the top spot in Sunday's elections. Our colleagues from partner station France 2 went to Sölvesborg, that's near the southern tip of Sweden, a town that's home to a little under 500 Syrian, Afghan, and Somali refugees, and where 20% of the population says it will be voting far right.
It's come too many. Stop the immigration.
So many haven't a good life here. I think they want to be in their own country. And there's so much criminality.
All right, and one person at one point asked, they're robbing people, although it's never happened to me.
Exactly. This is what we see, that most of the people who vote Sweden Democrats actually live in areas where they are not affected by this criminality that they are talking about. It is an important election coming up in Sweden, and it could change, I think, Sweden for the coming decades, probably. But it's still, we're still not quite sure where actually the Sweden Democrats' support, where it will end up. It could be, as you say, up to 20%. It could also, we have seen in the last couple of days that the support has actually gone down.
Sarah, you hail from a country where 1 in 6 people are born elsewhere. Are Swedes nervous about their identity? Do they really feel that?
I mean, we have to admit that there is a change in Sweden. When I grew up, and up until the 1980s, there was very, very few immigrants coming to Sweden. Everybody was blonde, blue-eyed, watched the same television shows, had the same history, had the same story. And since then, the immigration has been quite big. And, now, as you say, a big chunk of the population has roots elsewhere. We don't share the same history. We don't celebrate the same tradition. So, of course, there is Sweden as a homogeneous society, it was created as a very homogeneous society, is going towards something different, something more pluralist and maybe multicultural, if that's what you see. And yes, it will be a work, some tough job.
What's the answer, Jaski?
I think we have to think about what's going on at the moment. We have the two countries that have accepted the biggest numbers of immigrants in 2015 and after, Germany and Sweden, going through the same turmoil. Chemnitz in eastern Germany had all these neo-Nazi demonstrations and so on, and now Sweden with the vote. And these are two countries that are economically doing very well. Sweden has much bigger growth than France. Unemployment is very reasonable.
Under 7%.
Criminal statistics are not up. And the same goes for Germany. It has a very good and stable economy. And nevertheless, a good chunk of the population feels uneasy about this situation. And I think we have to think about what failed, what was missing from the generosity of welcoming large numbers of immigrants. I don't personally. I feel these countries were right to do it, and Merkel in 2015 was admirable in her reaction. But the backlash is incredible and forces us to think what went wrong. And I think these identity issues, identity politics is all over the place in the world today, whether it's in Brazil, in the US, in Europe, in the Philippines. And we have no answer to those questions. And certainly mainstream politicians have no answer. And that's the most worrying thing.
But doesn't this go back to Trump? Because what's underlying Trump's message is don't believe anyone. Don't believe politicians, don't believe teachers, don't believe your doctor. Just don't believe anyone apart from me, obviously. So when you can go to Sweden and Germany, but even other countries, England and France, there are similar sentiments. It doesn't really matter whether you point out that there isn't really a link between immigration and crime. People are going to believe it.
Yeah. Let me bring in Christopher Dickey. On Thursday, researchers at Oxford University published a study regarding the Swedish elections. 1 out of 3 articles shared on social media were what those researchers called junk news, distorted or fake.
Well, it isn't just junk news. Look, the basic problem is that when you combine anecdotes about crime with latent or blatant racism, you can build a vast popular following, because with racism, with xenophobia, those other people, they seem to be very sinister and waging all kinds of criminal conspiracies against you, and you can't go out in the street, and women will be raped, and so on and so forth. Germany, where there were these huge demonstrations, or big demonstrations in Chemnitz recently, crime is at a 26-year low. Trump became president claiming that the Mexicans were sending all their rapists and murderers across the border, and they're still trying to make the case that the undocumented immigrant who is alleged to have murdered a young woman in Iowa, that he should be a huge election issue in the midterms and in 2020. All of this based on 1 or 2 examples. But if you combine those examples with racism, you can make a lot of political momentum out of it, and that's exactly what's happened, and that's what has happened in Sweden. As Sarah was pointing out, the people who are voting for the Sweden Democrats are not the people who are living next to immigrants. They're people who don't even see immigrants most of the time. But they think that there's this sinister dark wave coming in.
Yeah, and I sort of wanted to point out that the Sweden Democrats exist in Sweden since 1980s, and they have been growing ever since. And they were boosted by the wave of or the refugee wave in 2015, but it didn't start there. It was something that was already growing, and I mean, especially in the local elections, we saw it way before the 2015 crisis.
And in the past weeks, suddenly, one issue that's overtaken identity politics, according to surveys, don't know if it's true, but that's what opinion polls suggest, is the environment, what with people reeling after those huge forest fires over the summer in Sweden.
Sweden saw the worst forest fires in its modern history. So of course this is something that really, it was close to home, to say. I mean, people really noticed climate change and how we need to live with.
But is it really a campaign issue?
Of course it is. What society will we have for the future? Of course, and it is an important issue for most Swedes, and all the political parties have an environmental program. But the campaign was for a long time hijacked by this immigrant and identity politics agenda. And so all these issues that, healthcare, education system, environment, that all the people really ranked very high in all the surveys, they never got through because media was talking so much about immigration and refugees and, criminality.
Is it our fault? Is it journalists focusing too much on this?
Well, it's not only journalists, as you pointed out. The news that are shared on social networks are not necessarily coming from journalists. And we have a huge echo chamber of manipulation that's going on. But we run the risk of having every election hijacked by this issue of the migrants, because we're only talking about that. And we're going to have European elections next May. And the far right and the populist parties are trying to get only one topic of discussion, the migrants. And that's really a trap we should all, citizens, journalists, politicians, try to avoid.
Andres Evagora, you were telling us before we went on air, you were in Greece this summer, and horrible forest fires that proved fatal in one instance. Do you see the environment coming up as a bigger issue than these other ones that we've been talking about?
In Greece, not yet. The people I spoke to, they were just coming out of the economic crisis. That's been the big news the last few weeks. There has been a backlash, but it's been a political backlash. Lots of people have been fired in Greece, the head of the police in that area, the fire service and so on. But whether it's becoming an issue as it has in Sweden, I don't see that right now.
All right, fears of an overheating planet, as we were saying, not just limited to Sweden. It was the week when France's most popular cabinet member handed the keys to the Environment Ministry over. Former TV host Nicolas Hulot, who slammed the door of the government live on Pierre Aski's radio station last week after being overruled one too many times inside of Emmanuel Macron's government. That, in turn, this week prompting an open letter calling to save the planet. That op-ed piece penned by 200 personalities, scientists, but also actors, directors, artists, musicians, and more. Here you're seeing a Facebook page for a rally and a march that's scheduled for Saturday in Paris. A 27-year-old French journalist's call on Facebook that's triggered something of a groundswell this Saturday, which coincides, Pierre Aski, with the Rise for Climate initiatives that are taking place around the globe. Do you sense there's a real change here in France on this issue?
No. No, to be blunt, I don't think so. I think we have a moment of emotion because Nicolas Hulot's resignation was very spectacular live on radio. And it was even more spectacular because, as he told us himself, he hadn't decided to announce his resignation when he came into the studio. And he had made his decision, but had not decided to announce it. And he finally, in talking, he decided to do it. So it created really a shock. And maybe for a few days we've been talking about environment, climate change, and that's a good thing. But to be very honest, I think we are still, all of us, trapped in this dilemma that we want to solve climate change issues, we want to solve the environment questions, but we also want to have more cars, more energy, more mobile phones, more consumption. And so our governments are just the reflection of what we are ourselves. And when there is an arbitration between development and environment, development takes over always, because voters will, everybody's in a short-term calculation, and that's and I don't think we've reached the point yet, although the planet is on fire, as is customary to say. We are not reached the point where we have this strong reaction.
Chris Verdicki, many of these Rise for Climate initiatives taking place Saturday where you are in the United States, is it getting any attention?
No. I'd be even more blunt than Pierre in France. I mean, I think that environmental issues here in America, although people, sure, there is a sizable part of the population that's very concerned about this, but it's just been overwhelmed by the political news and by all the kinds of issues that are pressed all the time by Trump. And, we can make a long list of the things that the Trump administration is doing to destroy the United States of America and the world, according to his critics. And unfortunately, destroying the environment is just one of them.
Do you sense a change here in France, Andreas?
No, I would tend to agree with Pierre.
Dear. 3 no's so far. Here we go.
But if there is one hope, I mean, the popularity of Lula came from the fact he wasn't a politician. So I agree with that. I don't think it's going to come from politics. It needs some superhuman guy who's maybe already popular to just push this agenda forward. Because if you ask people, everyone says, yeah, of course, it's a big worry. But when it comes to doing something about it and voting and changing people's lifestyles, as much as people make an effort, it's clearly not enough.
Sarah Bertelsen?
Let me be the optimist here then.
Okay, great. Oof.
I do sense a slight change. I mean, coming from a country where we've been recycling things, well, in Sweden, and for a very long time, I moved to France, and I was a bit shocked by, the lack of interest for environmental issues. But I do sense a more interest now, at least. And, we had this straw thing this summer, where suddenly people realized that it's stupid to use straws. And stopped using them, left them on the bar or the hotel or the restaurant. So, yeah, I think there's small steps, very, very small steps, but still moving forward.
There was something very revealing this week. Nicolas Hulot said on the radio when he resigned, as long as we are proud to produce the largest, the biggest container
ships,
we're doomed. And the next day, that largest container ship in the world was inaugurated in Le Havre, and you had to listen to every news item on the radio or on television. It was pride, because France had built the largest container ship. And so whatever Nicolas Hulot had said the day before was already forgotten, and we had this symbol of the consumption society that was being inaugurated with 2 ministers and applause from everybody.
That's the government. I do believe in some kind of civil society movement when it comes to
the answer will come from outside of government. We're going to leave it there, but I want to thank you, Sarah Bertelsen, Andreas Evagora, Pierre Aski, Chris Verdicki for joining us this week from New York City. Thank you for being with us here in The World This Week.